Hello, in this video I'm going to look at finding the domain and range of a graph. So when you're looking to find the domain and range of graphs, you're really looking to see for the domain what inputs are valid, and since inputs are graphed horizontally, right, left and right, that's what you're going to do is scan from left to right, and the order does matter. You do want to go from left to right, because there's a natural order to numbers. Numbers on the left are smaller than numbers on the right. So you scan from left to right. And then as you're scanning from left to right, if you're hitting graph, that means graph exists. And the reason the graph exists is because those inputs were valid, so that part of the domain is valid. Then for the range, it's the same idea, except that the range is graphed on the vertical axis. So you scan the graph from bottom to top. And again, order is important because on the bottom, right, the lower numbers start from the bottom and then you get increasing numbers as you move to the top. And again, where graph exists, the range is valid, or it's possible, right? So it's that part of the range is valid. You write it down. So here, let's go through a few examples. I have a line, and notice there are arrows, which means that it continues on infinitely in this direction and infinitely in that direction. So as I'm scanning from left here, the idea is I would run into graph. I would always run into graph, no matter how far to the left I go, because of this arrow going on infinitely, I would hit graph somewhere. And so it doesn't matter where I hit it, right? But just that I hit it. So that means the input is valid. So the idea is if I look at this input here, let's go ahead and get a color here. Let's say I'm talking about this input here. Well, it did what? It created that point on the graph. So therefore that input was valid because it created graph. And so basically as I go from left to right, I'm always touching graph. The graph always exists. So the domain is all real. Or some people write it like this, negative infinity to positive infinity. So in what they call interval notation. Now, if I go through the range, it's the same idea, but I go from bottom to top, right? So as I'm starting at the bottom, again, because of this arrow, there's always graph, and there will always be graph all the way through to the top. No matter where I am, there's graph, which means that output was available. So for example, for this input, this output is what's available. So is it possible to be, or if I say, is it possible to reach this output? Yes, right here. So the idea is all outputs are available. So the range is all real, or you can again say it this way in interval notation. Okay, let's look at another example. So here we have a parabola, and again, I'm just going to scan from left to right for the domain. So as I scan from the left, this arrow, it would go on forever and ever and ever and infinitely. So it would go, no matter how far left I went, I would always touch graph, or I'd always run into graph. So all inputs from negative infinity, and again here, because of this arrow, to positive infinity, I will always touch graph or run into graph as I'm scanning from left to right. So all inputs are valid. So for the domain, it's all real, or again, you can write it this way. Right. For the range, as I scan from the bottom though, there's no graph like here. So if you said to me, hey, I want to get to negative 10 in the output. Well, let's say that's over here. There's nothing. I can't do it. I just can't. It's not a possibility. So the first time, or the lowest value going from bottom to top, the lowest value is negative 5. From then on, I can actually reach whatever level I want two different ways, really, from two different inputs. So if you said to me, hey, I want to be at this level, well, all I have to do is go like this and say, okay, well, this input does it, and say it's here, this input does it, right? So there's two inputs that would take me to the output. So that output exists. Not only does it exist once, it exists twice. But all I need to do is have it exist once. So what outputs are possible? Well, actually, anything from negative 5 onward is possible. And because the arrows, it goes on infinitely. So for the range, we start at negative 5, right? There's the output value. And then go on to infinity. And negative 5 I can land on. So it is included. Now let's take a look at a slightly different graph that is contrived. So here we're looking at, and let me just make sure you can see all of it. Yes, you can. As I scan from left to right, for here, out here, there's no graph. So no inputs are valid because it's not creating any graph. The first time there's some graph is right here when I move all the way to -12. And at -12, I mapped or sent to here, -15. So -12 is my first, let me write domain, input that's valid, and I'm able to land on it because it's solid, right? So there's included. And then from there on, I'm creating graph, 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 and then here it's open, so -8, but I can't land there, so that wouldn't count. However, at -8, I do land here, and so that means -8 is an input that sends me somewhere. It does create graph. It doesn't matter that it doesn't create graph right here at the bottom point, but it does at the top point here. So at -8.7, so it's still creating graph. So there's no gap. So that means at -8.0001, I'm here, and then at -8, I'm here, right? But I'm still going somewhere, and it's creating graph. So as I keep scanning from left to right, I'm creating graph, boom, all the way up to -2. And if I try to go a little bit beyond -2, I'm sorry, not -2, 4, all the way up to 4. So all the way up to 4, I'm being sent somewhere. So I'm creating graph. A little past 4, there's nothing. It's an empty space. So basically, it's from -12 to 4. Right? And 4 sends me to part of a graph that I can land on it because it's solid. But then past 4, there's nothing, right? I'm not sent anywhere. So there's no graph created. So then I have to say union because there's a gap. And then we start back up at 6. However, 6, the input 6 sends me to an open dot, which I can't land on. So therefore, it's the beginning. It's going to be the beginning of an interval that will have inputs that create graph, but not 6. Now, the reason we go ahead and start at 6 and not 6.01 is because you got a lot of values between 6 and 6.1. You got 6.0001 and 6.0001. So to avoid all that, we just say, okay, 6 is the boundary, but you can't use 6 because it can't land on anything. So then from 6 all the way to what? 9, there's graph and you can land on it. And then there's a gap, right? From 9 all the way to 11, nothing, doesn't create any graph. And 11 doesn't create any graph, but it is the boundary, right? So then from 11 to what? 13, you've got graph. So from left to right, now you know where you're crossing or hitting graph, okay? Now we're going to do the range. So you're going to scan from bottom to top. And what I would say is pause the video and see what you get. So hopefully as you're scanning from bottom to top, order matters, you start at -15. And it's included because you can land on it. It's dark. It's solid. And then from there on, there's graph, but here, and let's see, at -9, you can't land on it. So it's not included, but it means that you could land on, as you're going this way, -9.00000001, whatever, however close you want to get. So everything up to 9, so -9, so that's the boundary. And then there's a gap from -9 to -7, but you can land on -7, so it's included. So you're here, right? And then here, all that's included. And actually in some of these output values, you can actually get there in more than one way. Like if I were to draw a line here, I'd actually have 4 inputs that would reach that output value. But all I care about is what are the output values, because I'm checking for range. So I'm scanning, and really, I don't see a break. So here's 3, and then as you go on, there's still graph, right? Because I'm hitting graph, all the way up to what? 7. But I can't land on 7. So it's like that. So, and then there's a break between 7 and 9. You can't land on there. Well, you can land on 7, but not 9. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You can't land on 7 or 9 for output. And then you start up at 9 and go all the way up to what? 15. So that's your range. It's where am I touching graph? Where can I land as I'm going from bottom to top? That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm doing the scan of. All right, thanks so much for listening.